Hey everybody, it's Dan, and welcome back to We Wargame. This is going to be another painting tutorial video for some Bretonnians of all things, but I'm actually painting, technically speaking, I use them as Kingdom of Aquitaine for the 9th Age, which is their equivalent for the Bretonnian faction, but essentially what we're painting here are medieval peasant kind of huntsmen, archers. These are Squires, is what I'm going to be painting these up as. And I mentioned in a short that I put out a minute ago that I'm doing these in what I'm calling 6th edition. It's really a 5th edition aesthetic that is very bright, almost garish looking Bretonnians, in contrast to the kind of grimdark blue and red that they went with the latter part of 6th edition. And so the Squire models, the old metal Squires that I think were re-released for the old world, I remember having like a blue and white color scheme. So I kind of ran with that. I went with a lighter blue than I might normally if I was doing a traditional painting style. But because we're doing my Razzle Dazzle style, which is going to involve a very heavy wash at the end, just blocking out color, a light dry brush, and then a heavy wash, I went with a lighter color here. This is Lothern blue for the tunic. It's going to be a split blue-white. And then these models are all from Oathmark. These are their human light infantry models with some minor conversion work, but by and large they are Oathmark. And they all have these cloaks, which don't exist on the Bretonnian Squire models, but in this case I thought it'd be a good opportunity to paint them up in kind of a drab green, kind of olive color. On the broader unit of 10 that I'm doing here, I have actually I think 4 different colors of all that kind of World War II army green color. And so I mixed it up a little bit, I did some blending, but here I have been using a lot of this Vallejo thinning medium. I didn't use it on the cloaks because the cloaks don't have very many folds, so I didn't think that this technique would work very well, so I just did a flat green color for the cloaks. But here you can see I'm mixing in the paint. This is Army Painter Barbarian Flesh with that Vallejo thinner, and it works really well. It turns it into almost like a contrast paint, which is nice because it'll run into the recesses, it'll leave some brighter areas up in the raised areas, which we will then boost with a dry brush of pure white before we wash these figures. Doing the same thing here with Xandri Dust. This is my beloved Xandri Dust. This is my wood green color that I use from Citadel, also heavily watered down, so you can see it's super thin, kind of runs like a contrast paint, and leaves some brighter areas in the top parts of whatever it is that I'm painting, and also on wood grain especially leaves a very nice like marbled effect, which will look even cooler once we hit it with a wash. But yeah, no backs of shields on these figures, it's just the bows and the arrows. And not very much metal either. I'm using Citadel Lead Belcher here. It's just on some of the figures have helmets, and then really just the tips of the arrows, and not much else to do there. And then for the hair, I'm using just a brown color. I mix up hair between figures too, or between units, models in a unit. So I think I used 4 or 5 different brown colors, but this is just Gorthor brown that I also use that thinning medium with. The ratio I'm going for is, I don't want to say quite 50-50, it's a little bit less than that. But my rule of thumb is I kind of start mixing in that thinning medium until it starts to turn almost like a grayish color. And that's usually my cue that the ratio is about correct. Doing the same thing here with leather colors. I usually use at least 2 different leather colors with figures like this just to give it a little bit of variety. So like shoes, belts, things of that nature will get, in this case, one of 2 colors, either Doombull Brown or Rhinox Hide. And I also mix these up, so like the first figure is going to get Doombull Brown shoes, and then he's going to get a Rhinox Hide quiver and belt, and the other guy is going to get kind of the reverse of that. And it's not exactly a pattern, I just kind of mix it up as I go down the line. I'll do one color and then I'll come through and hit everything else that I did not hit with the other color. It's sort of my methodology for doing that. And I think this watering down technique works especially well with leather for the same reason that I mentioned with the wood grain colors. It creates like a marbled look. The same thing happens here with leather, and especially in places like the bracer, on some of the belt buckles, stuff like that. It runs in such a way that it leaves very nice highlights behind that, as I've now mentioned a couple of times, we're going to boost up with a dry brush step at the end here. So same thing here, this is Rhinox Hide. And I'm just doing over the quiver and over the belt and on the shoes of the other figure as well. And at this point you can see these figures are actually almost done. There's not very much on them because the other half of the livery there I'm leaving white. This is Corax white. And one thing that you haven't seen me do but that I am doing between steps here is where I mess up Like if I accidentally hit an area that I didn't intend to, I'm coming back in with Citadel Corax white to neaten the area up. Again, mostly following the same kind of rules you would if you were using contrast paints, the same principle here. And then here's sort of the sleight of hand that we do from a painting standpoint, which is that you're going to take just pure white out of the pot. I use a makeup brush now for my dry brushing work, and you're going to dry brush the entire figure. I've mostly avoided the cloaks. We're going to talk about the cloaks here at the end. For those who have seen my other painting tutorials, you'll probably wonder why I'm doing the cloaks a little bit differently here. Again, flat color on the cloaks. I didn't water it down really. I'm not really going to focus much of my dry brushing efforts there, just because they are, for cloaks, I think quite flat. So we're going to come in and do some weathering on the cloaks at the end. But for this step, very, very light dry brush, super light, and focus more on coming back multiple times if you need to build the color up. Don't try to get it all at once, because you'll end up having streaks and things like that. And then I like to come in and do what I call dot highlights on the silver and the white areas. Everything has some white on it now. And you can see what I'm doing is I'm essentially highlighting the dry brush step. So if there were any areas that I felt got like an especially heavy dry brush, I'll come in and kind of do dots, typically focusing on like where you see me hitting there, like knuckles, edges of folds, things like that, and keeping it really light, as light as I possibly can. And this will, I always say it's going to look silly until you do this step, which is the heavy wash step. And this is functionally just Agrax Earthshade, just out of the pot Agrax Earthshade. And so you're going to wash everything. You're going to take a big heavy brush. I usually have the miniature kind of leaning over a paper towel like this, and you're just going to douse the figure. So everything's going to get it, even the white areas. Even if you have black on a figure, you're going to wash that as well, because it does have a subtle effect. And so then what you're going to do is, once this wash is applied, you're going to take your brush and you're going to wick away anything that you don't want. And you're going to find it's going to pool in areas, like in this case on the cloaks, on the shoes. You'll find on different figures that it wants to pool in different areas. So just pay attention as you go, wick away anything you don't need. Sometimes, especially if I'm painting over white areas like I have on these figures, I sometimes find it's handy to have a separate brush nearby that doesn't have any wash in it, no paint on it, just nice and clean. And this is what I'm doing here. I'm coming in and I'm basically taking away any of the wash that I don't want, especially on the upper areas there. It'll brighten up the white areas quite a bit. So that's another thing that you can do. I let them dry overnight, just because it's a heavy wash, so at least give them the night to dry. And then what I'm doing here is applying a preliminary matte varnish over the entire figure. This is Army Painter Matte, so I do recommend you have a matte varnish for this technique. And then we're going to do a couple of things here before the base. I'm going to do the eyes on these figures, which is, as you might expect, it's just going to be 2 dots of white on the eyes. This, I don't know how to give advice on this. It just takes practice, I think. But you want to use a very small brush. You can see I'm bracing my hands against each other. I've got it zoomed in, I think, as much as I can here. But yeah, just use a very fine brush. Make sure the paint's a little bit watered down, and take your time. And then the same thing applies for the pupils. You're going to use pure black, as you might expect. And I guess the only advice I could give here is that you want to actually aim for the top middle of the eye. A lot of like the instances of kind of wonky eyes where they're going off in different directions, I think is because the painter is aiming for the very center of the eye. So what you want to actually do is aim for like the top middle. And if you get it wrong on the first eye, what you actually should do on the other eye is try to mirror the placement. There's actually quite a few figures in my collection that are like looking off to the side, because on the first eye I got the pupil in the wrong spot. But if you kind of copy on the second eye, you can actually inadvertently make a cool expression. I mentioned the weathering that I wanted to do on these cloaks because they're quite large and kind of flat looking. So I came in with the color I use for the base color on my bases, like the initial color I use for my base work. This is Territorial Beige from Walmart Apple Barrel Paints. And I've watered this down pretty substantially, I would say. Yeah, I mean, at least 50-50, probably further. And I'm coming in and I'm doing, there's actually going to be 2, sometimes even 3 layers that I'm doing here. Ideally, you would use pigments if you had those. I don't have any in my collection at the moment, but pigments definitely look better for what I'm doing here, but this is kind of a poor man's version of it. And so what I'm doing is I'm going to do the first layer here that's going to be super, super thin down. And you can see I'm applying it first with a brush, and then I'm taking my dry brush and kind of stippling the top areas to kind of feather it out. And so that's going to create a nice like dried dirt effect. And then once that dries, this is a second figure I'm doing the same thing on, but what I'll ultimately do is come back with at least one more layer of non-watered down paint and focusing almost like you're dry brushing the bottom of the cloak up. You can kind of stipple it a little bit too, and it creates the effect of like caked on dirt and mud, which I thought looked pretty cool on these kind of green cloaks, both to help unify the colors. Again, I have at least 4 different colors across all these cloaks, so it helps blend them together a little bit, and it creates, I think, some visual interest on these guys that are supposed to look like they're, you know, rummaging around out in the forests for their day job. So anyway, I did that on all these figures. I hit them with a second coat of the matte varnish just to get rid of all the shine, and based them up, and here are the finished figures. So I'm pretty pleased with how these turned out. I didn't mention I painted the arrow fletchings in black. I normally would do white, but I thought that would work out better here. So I'm pretty pleased with these. So I think that they're going to be a cool addition to my Kingdom of Aquitaine Bretonnian army. So stay tuned for more painting and review content. But as ever, in the meantime, I appreciate you dropping by for this one. And until next time, happy gaming.